Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Once again, thank you to all of you who have joined us thus far. We very much appreciate your attendance and welcome to our monthly webinar with the Microsoft Federal Business Applications team. My name is Craig Harris. I am a technical specialist on that team, and this session, gosh, we've been doing these webinars for well over a year now. I think like a year and a half. So we're really excited to have you all here, and it's been a really fun ride to present this content. So just kind of a good general overview of what we're going to go through today. I'm going to kind of kick it off with some community overview updates, some of the things that are happening around our greater Microsoft community. We'll give some product updates to let everyone know some new and exciting stuff that's come down the line. And then the main event for today is actually going to be all around all things identity. So Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory, because we do so much love to rename things here at Microsoft. But we'll be able to go through some ways to manage that overall governance and some best practices with our guest speaker today, Mike Laperle, who will step through that, and I'll introduce him once we get to his session. I do want to add one last note as we're kind of moving through this, that we are recording this session. But once we get to a Q&A here at the end, we will disable the recording, and you'll be able to come off of mute and ask questions. We won't record that session or that portion of this session so that you can be comfortable talking. I do want to note that this is a Microsoft digital event, and to that end, we do try and create a safe and welcoming space where everyone can share and learn from one another. We do reserve the right to remove anyone if we need to, if that becomes disruptive in any way, but just please bear that in mind as we're sort of moving through our content. And we also want to be transparent about what we do with any of the information that we may have gathered as you were registering for this webinar. We do capture your name and your email address. This is a great way for us to reach out to you directly if there are important product updates that we think you need to know about, or if there are follow-on webinar sessions that we want to try and share out with the greater team. We would use that information for that. But if for whatever reason you're not comfortable with that, you want to remove yourself from any of those mailing lists, absolutely no problem. Please simply reach back out to us and let us know, hey, please remove my name from all this, and we will absolutely do so. So throughout our session today, you should have access to the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. But then once we get to the end of our overall session here, we're actually going to turn off the recording, and I'm going to enable everyone to come off of mute. You'll still have to take yourself off of mute, but you'll have the ability to. And you can raise your hand and we can have a direct Q&A session where you can ask myself questions. You can ask my colleague, Jamie Willis-Rose, who is monitoring the chat, or you can ask, obviously, Mike as well, questions about BizApps writ large, or if you want to ask him about Entra ID and Azure, please feel free to do so then. Okay, so to kind of kick it off a little bit with some of our community updates, we can't really talk about community without mentioning the Community Days website. Which I plug as often as I absolutely can because I think it's this great consolidated central space where you can find out what's happening across the world, really, when it comes to Microsoft community events. And if you haven't engaged in the Microsoft community, please do so. It's one of the most rewarding experiences that you can possibly have here in the Microsoft space. You'll get to meet and talk to really talented people like some of the folks we'll have here today. And you also get to learn things, right? You get to network. It's this really awesome place where you can engage. And you can filter down to like just specific countries or regions. We've hosted several local boot camps and sessions here in Arlington in our Reston office, and those will often get posted here. So it's a great way to try and keep tabs on everything. And if you want to get to the link, I have a convenient little QR code here that you can just scan, and it'll take you straight there. And we can't talk about meetups without talking about the Microsoft Power Platform Conference that's happening October 3rd to 5th in Las Vegas this year. I'm going to be there. My colleague, Jamie Willis-Rose, we're going to have a delegation from Microsoft Federal in attendance. It's going to be a really exciting time, and it's almost kind of like this, once a year community reunion where all of us collectively can get together, share everything that's happened throughout the year, and then learn from one another. And that learn from one another is really, really key. One of the most rewarding things that I found at last year's conference down in Orlando was not just understanding how tech works, but understanding best practices that people have learned from actually engaging with some of the technologies that I hadn't used yet and then things to know as we're rolling that out in our overall space. We will have federal representation. So this is not just a commercial event. We will be talking about our government community clouds, and we will be organizing a direct session time with some of our product group leaders as we can. And once we've identified like all the folks that we can have together in those overall sessions. So if you want to know more information, please reach out to me, reach out to Jamie. We can connect you to the right people, but it's going to be something you don't want to miss. And again, convenient QR code here dropped on the slide. Feel free to just scan that. It'll take you straight to it. I do hope that you're able to register. Okay, so we did mention that we are recording this session. So everything that we do in our community events, we try and create some sort of digital recording, and we get that uploaded in two different places. We have a Microsoft Federal GitHub repo that just has all sorts of useful information in it. It has federal white papers, actual live demonstrations with solution files that you can download and install today. There's white papers completely dedicated to security, where you can learn how the Power Platform aligns to TIC 3.0. You can learn CISA recommendations for how to engage with our environments. All of our FedRAMP packages, all that information is consolidated in one space. And we also have links to our YouTube channel where we will load recordings from our past webinars, including the one that we're doing today. So do please feel free to check those out. We have the link here. I imagine my colleague Jamie is dropping stuff in the chat as well. But do please engage with us. We love to share this information as we can. So we're going to be talking a lot today about Azure, which may seem strange coming from the Microsoft Federal Business Applications team, but it really isn't all that odd if you kind of collectively understand how all this stuff is architected and how everything works together. So everything in the Power Platform is just a good idea that started in Azure, right? So when we're looking at this stuff, if we're looking at how to build an app, if we're looking at how to create a relational database, that's absolutely something you can do with SQL in Azure, or you can use the Dataverse version of that we've created for you. So these are all just things that we've built on top of Azure infrastructure. And because of that, a lot of the underpinning things that make all this stuff work also call back to Azure. And a good example of that is identity, which is something that we're going to go over today with Mike whenever he does his session over Entra ID. So it's important that we kind of understand how all this stuff works together so that when we're talking about the Power Platform, when we're talking about dynamics, we're also having a conversation in a one Microsoft frame where Azure is a part of that conversation. And having an existing Azure data estate just enables you that much more to capitalize on all the technology you have available to you. So that's how all this stuff kind of fits together. And we would not be able to have a conversation around the Power Platform, around Microsoft, without talking about AI, especially in 2023. But it's important to know, and we really like to lean in on this when it comes to our federal customers and our federal community, because I think very often it can feel like all the new and the exciting sort of passes us over in the government community clouds. Like it'll make its way to us eventually, and I'm doing air quotes here, but we don't necessarily get accustomed to seeing all the new and exciting immediately in our spaces. But the reality is, it doesn't necessarily need to be new and exciting stuff built on large language models to be able to automate in really powerful ways. Microsoft is not new to the AI game. And a good example of that is AI Builder, which is just Azure Cognitive Services that's been repurposed in a low-code environment for the Power Platform. That's been there for years, and you can absolutely find that in our government community clouds today. And more often than not, when we're trying to find and identify ways to streamline processes, to flatten overall workloads and make things simpler for people to get time back and focus on your job and not just documenting things, AI Builder is often one of the first places that we go to try and automate that. Another area that I personally use all the time whenever I'm building things out, including in GCCH, is if I'm building out a Power Automate flow where I need to transform data in some way. Well, using natural language backed by AI in a Power Automate flow, you can format data by examples. And then once you put in the data that you're going to receive in a given trigger or action in Power Automate, and then you tell the AI what you want the data to look like on the other end, it'll just spit out the expression that you need to pop into your flow to where you can transform that data in line. Now, previously, you would need to like put in the expression. You think you got it right. You hope the syntax is good if you're not as good at that like I am. And then you would test it and see, well, did it transform the data that I wanted it to, or in the way that I wanted it to, or did it break? More often than not, if I built it, it broke. But now by using natural language to transform this in line and have AI just tell you how to formulate that expression, you can take all that trial and error out of it and get it right on the first time. That's not net new. That's been there for some time now. So whenever we talk about AI and we talk about it in the context of the federal space, it's important to know there's so many things in the menu that you can play with. And one of the things that I often hear whenever we're talking about, slowly moving into this artificial intelligence space where we have the era of co-pilots and we're trying to figure out how we can automate things intelligently using, large language model backed data. It's important to know that Microsoft is very cognizant and is very deliberate in making sure that we are approaching that in a way that's responsible. Because I think that collectively, as we move forward into this space, both as Microsoft, as our partners, as our competitors, and as our community, we collectively owe it to ourselves to make sure that if we're introducing these tools, we're introducing them in a way that's fair, reliable, inclusive, and transparent. And I do hear about these conversations whenever we're having these conversations with our federal customers, and Microsoft takes that very seriously. And if you want to know more about that, there's again another convenient QR code here. Please scan that and follow it over to learn how we're trying to think proactively about how to engage these tools in a way that makes sense. Because ultimately, especially in the federal space, we have a responsibility to our citizenry, to our customers, to get this right and to get it right in the first time. Help us get there collectively by leaning in with us on these principles. And this is another exciting thing that I do want to kind of stand still by because again, we in the federal space we tend to think, oh, this stuff is passing me by, it won't be here for forever. Well, Azure OpenAI, which is a separate service that is solely installed in Azure Commercial, is absolutely something that you can use to connect from Azure Government using a secure infrastructure built within Azure and start leveraging that today. And if we're looking at federal accreditation boundaries, it's now FedRAMP High accredited, right? So this is something that you can absolutely start using today to unlock really powerful ways to engage these tools within your space. And if you want to learn more, I'm probably sounding like a broken record, but I did try to make this convenient. Again, another QR code. Please do feel free to scan that and then learn how you can leverage these tools today. Again, FedRAMP High accredited today, built in the commercial space. Okay, and with that, I will stop talking. I imagine everyone's tired of hearing from me anyway, and I will hand it over to the real star of this show, Mike Laperle. Mike is kind of like a one-stop guru when it comes to all things Azure. He's an Azure Cloud Solution Architect, now a senior technical specialist on the Azure team, and an absolute just specialist when it comes to all things identity, and someone that I've leaned on many times when it comes to this topic. So, with no further introduction, please, Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. So today, I think we're going to talk about, Entra ID, what was formerly known as Azure Active Directory, but more specifically, how you can leverage Entra ID when you're dealing with the Power Platform and when you're dealing with multiple customers of your own or partners, contractors, etc. Right. So we're going to talk a lot about external facing scenarios. And without further ado, let's dive right in. So one of the key mechanisms that sort of enables this capability is of course identity, right? There are a lot of use cases in federal, across federal, and federal to external customers like partners of yours, vendors, etc., where you want to be able to bring in those kinds of users to collaborate on all kinds of things. You want to be able to share resources with those partners and with those organizations, not just internally to your own, right? So one of the big mechanisms that helps enable that is, of course, identity, right? How do I bring this person in so that I can grant them access to resources that I've created that I want to share with them, whether that's a Power BI report, a Power App, specifically a document in SharePoint or a document on OneDrive, whatever those kinds of things are, or even third-party services, right? Whatever those kinds of things are, Azure Active Directory, or what we're now calling Entra ID, can help you with those scenarios. And the capability that I'll talk about today is built in. So there's a lot of advantages. You'll be able to take immediate advantage, whether you're an Azure government or an Azure commercial customer. You'll be able to take advantage of these capabilities and leverage them in your own scenarios where you want to be able to share these resources, even if those resources are Power Platform or not. So one of the primary mechanisms, let me go ahead and share my screen here. I'm not going to PowerPoint everybody to death. I just have a few slides here to sort of lay down the basic premise, right? One of the key capabilities that enables us to collaborate and interact with users from other organizations is a capability known as B2B, which stands for business to business. This is a capability that's included in Entra ID external identities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and all the different things that that offers in terms of how you can control and manage those kinds of relationships and users within your own organization, and how you can use those things to benefit yourselves and the resources that you're looking to share. But in order to sort of talk about B2B, I think what we need to do is sort of talk about how we used to collaborate in a traditional environment. And that's kind of what this image here is meant to depict, right? So in a traditional scenario, when we wanted to share information, what we would normally do is exchange that information, right? Whether that was through email or uploading it to something that we both had access to. And that's how we would typically exchange information, right? Obviously, there's a lot of security risk to doing that. Not to mention, it's kind of a terrible user experience, right? I think we've all been there where we've had to edit a spreadsheet or a Word document and we're passing back 20 different versions and having to rename it as we go. And not to mention all the storage that eats up because we're maintaining all these different versions of the same thing. So very cumbersome, very difficult to deal with. One of the other patterns that we often saw is what I like to call the DMZ model, right? This is a model where we would create through our own IT processes an account for this person that came from another organization that we wanted to allow to come in and share resources with. We typically did this in very heavy infrastructure models where maybe it was, hey, I want to share access to an application that I have that exists within my own boundaries and my own data centers. And so what we would do is we create the secondary identity. Sometimes we would even create an entire separate directory so that we could maintain these identities for these non-organizational users. But that was a lot of work as well, right? It's a lot of work on the IT staff because they had to create and manage the accounts. They had to worry about the life cycle. They had to worry about issuing credentials for those users, having to reset passwords and all the support that's involved with that. And that can also be very difficult, not to mention the cost of that model, right? All that heavy infrastructure that was required to handle those things, and the user, right? The end user had to remember yet another account in the repertoire of X number of accounts that they would have in order to access this thing. So if they were only accessing these resources once a month or once a year, they might forget, right? Oh, I forgot the account that I had to use to log in here. And so, and then that would of course cause delays and really restrict our ability to collaborate. So the way that we do it in Entra ID with external identities is through a process called B2B. And what this does is the B2B process is native to Azure Active Directory. You can use this with other Azure Active Directory customers or other Entra ID customers. This would include other agencies, any of your partners. So whether they use Office 365 services, Power Platform services or not, you would be able to leverage B2B as a way to bring them into your organization and grant them access to resources that you want to share with them. The way that this works is it creates what we call a guest object. This is a unique security principle in your tenant that is actually bound to the tenant or the place in which their identity actually comes from, right? So if they're another Office 365 or another Microsoft customer, they would have their own tenant, right? I want to invite so-and-so from agency.gov. And when I invite so-and-so from agency.gov, they can actually access my resources using the same login that they might be using to access Office 365 or their own Power Platform resources. The same identity, the same email, all of those things are the same for that user because in effect, it is the same account. What we're doing is we're creating a relationship between the guest principal which is stored in your directory, and that's where you create those authorizations or the permissions needed to access whatever these resources are, Power BI report or Power App, etc. You grant those authorizations locally, and then they use their own authentication to access your resources. You're still in control of all of your policies, right? So these are your resources that you want to share with this user. They're still subject to policies that you can enforce on them. These would be conditional access policies like require multi-factor authentication, require them to be inside the United States, all of the sort of policy mechanisms that you or your ICAM teams may already be used to. Those are still enforced even for the guest user. The only thing we don't have control over is the primary credential used when logging in. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, especially because when we're talking about federal customers, we're living in this world where phishing resistant credentials are the de facto. They're the standard in which we operate. And phishing resistant credentials also happen to be passwordless credentials, right? So there's a lot of advantages there. So we talked a little bit about B2B. We talked about how to get how the B2B model works. How do you onboard guests, right? How do you get them into your organization or into your tenant so that you can leverage them and share resources with them, like a particular Power App or a particular Power BI report? Let's talk about the different ways in which you can onboard guests, right? And these ways, they vary, right? There is no one way to utilize the methods that you see here. You can certainly manually onboard users where it might make sense, and you can automate other groups of users where that makes sense. You don't have to use just one model. You can certainly mix and match and use multiple variations of these. Right. So the first category is sort of manually, right? We do these by hand. One of the ways in which you see this is what we call ad hoc invites. If any of you are familiar with SharePoint or OneDrive, when you've been in that tool and you want to share a particular document, maybe you're sharing with a coworker or a colleague, that mechanism is also the same mechanism, barring our administrative policies, is the same mechanism that we can use to bring external users to share that same resource with, right? So if it's, let's say it's an individual document, some Word document that I'm storing in OneDrive and I want to share it with an external partner, I can type in their email address and click share, and it will send them an email that says, "Hey, so and so is trying to share a document with you," and they can click on a link. They can what will happen is a redemption process, and they will be able to access that document using their own account that they have for their own environment from their home organization. And that is an ad hoc invite, right? We do that as needed. These are typically built into SaaS products like Office 365, where you can share that content directly. And it's usually run by individual users, the person who has the need to share the thing, to share the resource. The other one is bulk invitations. It's very similar to the ad hoc method. The only difference here is that we can compile a CSV. Let's say I've got a project that's coming up in a couple of weeks, and I want to be able to share a whole folder with all of the project members. But let's say that the majority of these project members are external users. Maybe it's 50, and I don't want to hand jam 50 users in and grant them access to a folder. Maybe I just want to populate a list into a CSV. What you can do is you can take that CSV, you can hand it off to your Entra ID administrators, and they can import the CSV, and it will perform the bulk operation of inviting the users. They'll receive an email that says, "Hey, you've been invited to organization X," and then it's your responsibility to simply coordinate how you want to authorize those users, i.e. putting them in a group and granting that group access to the folder, or individually adding all the users to the folder for permissions. Entirely up to you. So those are all manual methods. When it comes to bulk, there's two primary mechanisms that sort of stick out here, and I'll get into details on number two. But the first is the programmatic access. Entra ID, like many of our cloud resources, is accessible via an API interface we call the Graph API. And specifically, there's an endpoint called the invitation endpoint, and this allows you to, using programmatic access, call this invitation endpoint and invite users at scale using some kind of automation tool, right? Whether that's Power Automate, a Logic app, or some third-party tool. You can use that to read from whatever directory or whatever source of information you want to read from, that collection of users you want to be able to bring in, call the API, and bulk create the guest users. And you can choose whether or not those users receive an email at all. You may just want to create the users in your directory as guests, and then use your own custom email or custom notification process to say, hey, I've brought you in. I want to share a resource with you, whether it's an application or something else. So that's programmatic access. We recently introduced a new feature called cross-tenant sync. Cross-tenant sync is a built-in capability that allows an organization to allow another organization to push users to them automatically. And what this does is it allows, let's say I'm agency 1 and I want to allow agency 2 to push users to me. I go into my access policies and I allow agency 2 specifically, of course, not all agencies, I allow agency 2 to say, hey, you can send users, you can create guest users in my directory. And what that allows agency 2 to do is then create a scope, i.e. who it is that they want to push, what attributes they want to synchronize with those. And then once they've created that scope and they've enabled that configuration, that allows them to push the users into your organization along with all of the attributes that they're also syncing. This is ongoing, so it will also keep those users up to date. So if one of those users leaves the organization, it will automatically remove that guest object from your tenant as well. So a lot of benefits there. It's not something that you're going to want to use in every situation or with every partner. So just remember, you can always mix and match. And I'll have a diagram in just a second where we'll talk about cross-tenant sync. And I'll also show you some of those things in the actual Entra ID portal as well. And then the last method is known as self-service, right? This is our ability to say, hey, I'm going to put a process or a mechanism out there, and I'm going to allow users from another organization to use that process to onboard themselves or to request access to whatever these resources are that I want to share. And we do this through what are known as access packages. Again, a built-in capability in entitlement management within your Entra portal. And you can configure these. These are out-of-the-box mechanisms that you can configure. You can add approvals. You can create policies for specific domains or specific organizations. So if I wanted to have a policy that only allows Microsoft.com users to come in and access resources or request access, I can certainly do that, and I'll demonstrate that as well. And then you can also manage the life cycle as part of that access package, right? So if I only want these users to be able to come in and use my Power App for 30 days, I can create an access package that grants them access to the package and eliminates that access after that 30-day period. So there's lots of advantages to using self-service because it allows the end users, the consumers of whatever these resources are that you want to share, to decide whether or not they actually want to consume those things, as opposed to sort of what we tend to do is play this guessing game of, I'm going to bring on everybody, and if 10% of the population uses my resource that I'm sharing, then so be it. If not, then I've wasted, all of that time onboarding all these people that aren't going to actually leverage that kind of access. So that's how you onboard all of your guests. These are the different ways in which you can do this. Once you've onboarded that identity, how you grant that access, again, whether you use an access package or whether you have some other process that assigns those permissions, is entirely up to you. Note that this capability isn't just for Microsoft services. It works out of the box for Office 365 and all of the Microsoft Cloud properties, including Power Platform, Azure, etc. But it also functions for third-party applications that you've integrated with your Entra ID tenant, right? So whether that's ServiceNow or maybe it's a Cisco AnyConnect VPN app, right? All of those things can leverage B2B because they all use what we call modern authentication. And these same mechanisms, how you onboard those users, can be leveraged to bring the users in. And then it's just a matter of saying, all right, these group of users or these individual users can have access to ServiceNow or Office 365 or Power Platform, right? You dictate those authorizations. A guest user by default has no inherent permissions within your tenant. So just bringing the user into your directory doesn't give them access to anything. And that relationship is always a per user basis. There is no option to say, hey, everybody from this organization can come in and do these things unless you create an access package that has a policy that would allow that. But me inviting, Joe at agency one doesn't mean that everybody else from agency one can come in and access those resources. I still have to uniquely identify those users and grant them the authorization necessary to access those resources. So the next question might be, how do we govern that access, right? How do we govern once I've brought these people on, or even how we want those people to be brought on? How can I govern those relationships with certain organizations? And the answer here is what we call cross-tenant access policies, or acronymed, because we all love those in the federal world, XTAP. And what these allow you to do is they allow you to create policies for specific organizations. Now, these policies only work when the other organization is also an Entra ID tenant organization, i.e., they possess Office 365 or any of the other Microsoft Cloud properties. And we can create outbound settings. This would affect our users going to another organization to access resources that are being shared with them. We can turn that off as a federal customer or on for all. By default, your outbound access is on. This would allow any other organization to invite your users to access their resources. And you can certainly control that. On the receiving side, or the resource, we have inbound settings, right? What a specific partner is allowed to do or access within my own organization. And I can configure the inbound, and I can allow a small set of users from an organization to access certain things. It doesn't grant the access again. This is a governance control that says if these people already exist or they're going to be invited in the future, these policies will govern what they can and cannot have access to. So if we're in a situation where, hey, partner X users should only ever access Power BI, we can go into our cross-tenant access policies and say partner X can only ever access Power BI. They cannot access SharePoint, they cannot access Teams, ServiceNow, or any of those other applications because I, as an administrator, don't want them. There's no reason for them to access those things. And the way that this works is it follows the most restrictive setting. So if a SharePoint administrator says, I don't want external users from this organization accessing my resources, but my policy says you can, the SharePoint administrator wins, right? They will not be allowed to access those resources. The inverse is also true. If I create a policy that says, nope, no SharePoint access for this organization, and the SharePoint admin says, I don't care who it is, they can access these things, I win, right? That users from that organization cannot access SharePoint because I've defined those governance settings in there. The other thing, which is a very interesting capability, is what we call trust settings. And this allows you to send or receive signals from those remote organizations. And it's these three signals that you see listed here, which is MFA claims, their compliant device claims, and their hybrid join claims. So if you had a policy, let's say, that required users from agency X to access your resources using agency X issued computers, GFEs, if you will, I can actually enforce that policy. Even though I don't control those devices they are managed by and come from that remote organization. As long as that remote organization has that signal available in their own tenant, it can be shared with me so that my policies can evaluate that and decide whether or not that user should have access, right, as part of my conditional access policy evaluation. Right, so that's how XTAP policies work, and I'll walk through some of the settings in a cross-tenant access policy so you can get a better idea of the kinds of things that you can do there as well. One of the last slides I have here is just really on the cross-tenant synchronization example. We talked about cross-tenant synchronization as being a push configuration, and then in this example here, you can see that both Fabricam Mexico and Fabricam US are able to push users to Contoso, right? So now Contoso has guest users from both Fabricam Mexico and Fabricam US that they can use to authorize access to certain applications if they so choose. So that ends the PowerPoint portion of this. I will stop just briefly on this slide. This slide sort of just describes what that invitation and redemption process looks like. Of course, the exception to this is when you're using cross-tenant sync or access packages to onboard users because there's no invitation, right? This just describes what that invitation process looks like. As you can see here, it's not just exclusive to other Microsoft customers. You can use B2B capabilities with customers who maybe they leverage Gmail, or maybe it's their own custom mail system that you want to bring on. All of those will function. It uses an OTP code to onboard those users as well. And again, no limitations in terms of the kinds of applications that can leverage these capabilities, as long as it's an application that's integrated with your tenant using a modern authentication protocol like SAML or OpenID Connect. You'll be able to take advantage of B2B and leverage those external users to access those systems with little to no effort or code changes on your system itself. So let's go into just a brief demonstration here, right? And I'll try to make this a little interactive for you folks in the audience. So I have here a sample application, right? This is just an Angular app running on an app service in my Azure subscription that is bound to my Entra ID tenant, right? I will post this link in the chat for anybody who's interested. And you can actually go and you can visit this application right now, right? It's published to the internet. You'll notice my screen will look a little bit different than yours, but what you will see is you'll see a login button. And if you attempt to click that button without doing anything else, what will happen is you'll be able to type in your username. If you're not already SSO'd in, you'll be able to type in your username and your credential, and it will tell you, sorry, you don't exist in Mike's directory. You're basically, you don't exist to me, right? So it'll say, sorry, you can't access this application because you don't exist, but you can exist, right? What you do is you actually click this link here. This link will take you directly to an access package that I have implemented that grants access to this application. And this application or this access package is what I use to onboard guests in this demonstration. And I'll show you, we'll walk through that access package. We'll also walk through some of the cross-tenant access policy settings. So if some of you want to go visit this and you want to click this link and go through that request process, you're more than welcome to. At near the end here, I'll actually approve those requests that I see as I get through it, and you'll be able to then click the login button, and you'll actually be able to log in, and you'll get a screen that's similar to mine, only it will show you what your principal name is as opposed to what you see on my particular screen. So let's take a look at our access package, and we'll also take a look at external identities in that relationship. So we'll go to entitlement management. This is where our access packages are contained. You can see here I've got quite a few access packages, but the one that relates to this particular application that I showed you earlier is right here, right? My custom app OIDC. An access package contains resources. And those resources are ultimately the thing that we want to access with the role in which we want to access it using, right? So in my case, and you can add multiple resources. You could use this to say, hey, I'm going to onboard users to 4 different Power Apps and 1 Power BI report. You could have one package that does that, right? You can also use this for your own internal users as well. So don't think of this as just an external only mechanism. You can certainly use this, hey, I'm an HR user and I want to get access to HR tools. You could use access packages as a way to define that process. But in my case, I've got a custom application here, right? You can see the type is application. And the role is default access. I could add additional resources. I could add a group or a team. I can add applications that are integrated with my Entra ID tenant, and I can also add SharePoint sites. These are the default resources that we can share or add to our access packages. In my case, I've just got the one, and then we have what are called policies. And in my case, I have 3 separate policies, right? This is what the user has to do or what those lifecycle controls are that govern how that user accesses it and how long it takes them or how long their access is good for. Right, so I actually have 3 policies. I have one for Microsoft users. These are actually a partner organization to my particular lab environment that you see here, right? So anybody coming from @microsoft.com does not require an approval. There's no approval required. And as you can see here, their assignment will expire after 90 days. So after 90 days, they will lose access to the application that I just showed you. I also have a policy for external users. These would be all other external types of users aside from people from Microsoft.com, right? So what this does is it does require an approval. I happen to be the approver, and the assignment will expire after 14 days. So you'll get access, you'll be able to log into my app, but you'll only be able to do that for 14 days. You can request an extension as part of that process. I'll get to that in just a minute. And then I also have a policy for my internal users. These are users who are members of my organization or my lab. And these users get access to it for a whole year, and there's no approval required. They can just click it and it processes, right? So these are the kinds of different policies I can instantiate. Let's take a look at one of these policies really quickly. You can see here I can name and description. I can select all kinds of different requests. This is how I differentiate the policies, right? My internal users for users who already exist in my directory, or maybe it's for users who do not exist in my directory, i.e. external organizations. I can configure specific connected organizations, which is what I did with my Microsoft.com. So you can see here, I can add. I've got a list of already connected organizations that I've set up in advance. Microsoft.com is one of them in here somewhere. And I would select that, and that's how that policy would be able to apply to just a specific organization. So if you wanted to create an onboarding package for a partner of yours or for a set of users for a partner of yours, you could actually do that by ensuring that you've created the connected organization and implementing that in your policy here. Right, so here I can say all. You can see I've got a single stage approval, but you can do up to 3. I am the approver, and I do require, or do not, sorry, require justification from the approver when approving. Right, I can request information, right? I can request attributes. I can ask them questions and format those questions, and then those are things that could be required or optional that the user fills out. As you'll see, if any of you click on that access package link, you have to provide a little bit of information. One of those for mine happens to be your location, right? So you can type in whatever you want in that location field, and then that'll get provided to me. And then lastly is the life cycle. And the life cycle allows me to, again, determine that governance control so that I'm not just granting a bunch of people access and then forgetting about them. Instead, I can actually dictate, hey, do I want that access to end on a particular date? Maybe it's just for a very short period of time, a number of hours. Or maybe that access never expires, right? So I've got all these different controls. I can implement access reviews. So if I had the access that was good for, let's say, a whole year, but maybe every quarter I wanted that access to be reviewed, hey, do you still need this? I can have a manager do that, or the person who has the access can self-attest to whether or not they still need that access. And there's also a bunch of advanced settings. I won't go through all of these. We certainly have documentation if this is of interest to you that you can look at. And then last is custom extensions. What these do is a logic app that allows me to process custom logic that I have as a result of a particular stage in my access package. So maybe after the assignment is granted, I want to do something custom, call an API or check a database or do something else, right? I have the ability to do that with a custom extension. So that's how the access package is built. Let's take a look at, see if anybody filled in that access package. There's a page here that you can go to called myaccess.microsoft.com. If you are a Azure Gov user, it would be the same URL, just .us instead of .com. And this allows you to not only see what packages you can request within your own organization, if you have any, but as an approver, I can also come here and I can approve. As you can see, Jamie's filled this out. I can approve his access live. I can see his request details, all of that information. I can say, hey, because you are cool, right? And submit, and he'll get a little email notifying him that his access was approved. And now he'll actually be able to go to this sample application and log in, right? And that's how that functions, right? So that's an access package. Let's take a look at our governance controls in our external identities where we can configure things like our cross-tenant access settings. Before I get into the cross-tenant access settings, one thing that I wanted to mention here is some of you may be familiar with identity concepts such as federation. You may be asking, hey, can I use this to integrate with providers with other third-party providers. Maybe I've got a customer that's using ADFS, for example, and they want to federate with me directly. You certainly can. You can integrate normal federation providers using SAML or WSFed. They still are B2B. It will still create a guest object, so that from your perspective, that won't change, even though they're not using Azure AD or their email to authenticate. In this case, they would use whatever their federation provider happens to be, but they would still come in as a B2B guest object. So all of those same concepts that we talked about, they still apply. But let's take a look at our cross-tenant access settings. So you have a default setting, right, where you can choose whatever those defaults are. You can turn everything to blocked, and then any organization that you add here would be by exception to whatever your default setting is. So you can see here, I clearly have a lot of organizations, but you can see the majority of them just have the inherit from default. I don't need them here if my default happens to be allow, right? I don't need these organizations here because I haven't changed their default. You only have to create a policy for an individual organization if you want to change what your default settings are. You want to enable cross-tenant synchronization, or you want to configure some of the redemption settings for those, which would, of course, make the experience a little bit easier on our guest user when they come in. They don't have to click an accept message. So let's take a look at one. We'll look at National Institutes of Health, right, NIH. You can see here that I can customize whether I want to limit it to a specific set of users or groups. I would need to, and again, this is my inbound, so these are NIH users coming to me. I would need to configure this so that they provide those external group IDs or those external user IDs, right? I can also limit by applications. I can say, hey, I'm gonna limit it to, just Office 365, right? Or maybe it's a third-party application, right? Maybe I want to limit to Cisco AnyConnect, right? Or some other thing that I have integrated, right? ServiceNow, you can see here, right? So I can say, hey, when they come in, they're only going to ever be allowed to access those things. Somebody still has to onboard them and authorize them to those applications. But if somebody were able to onboard them and authorize them to some other application, they would now be denied access to those applications because I've set in my policy that they cannot access anything other than the ones that I defined here. Whoops. Let me go to the trust settings so you can kind of see what these look like. Again, if that organization has multi-factor authentication signals, let's say they're using PIV cards or CAT cards or FIDO devices, rather than me having to revalidate that credential, I can actually leverage the signal coming from their own organization that says, you know what? When Joe logged into his own Outlook this morning, he used a PIV card. He used a CAT card. I've already validated that. Here's the assertion that says I did so. And now you can revalidate that against your own policy without having to prompt that user. So it does provide a true single sign-on experience while maintaining that zero trust kind of behavior, right? Validating everything that we want and allowing you guys to maintain those policies and those audit records that you desire. And then lastly, of course, is the cross-tenant sync. As you can see here, the only configuration for me on an inbound is to allow users from this organization to push, allow admins from that organization to push users to me. And so that's how that functions. We'll take a look at the outbound settings, but I think what you'll also see is that the outbound settings are relatively the same. I've got the same settings. I can turn on redemptions. And of course, I can limit what applications my users should be accessing. So if I don't trust a partner in particular, and I only want my users to go to that partner to use Teams features or SharePoint features, I can actually restrict that down to a specific application so that my users aren't accessing other applications shared by that organization if I don't want that to happen. Right, so those are the basic premise. That's the basic capability of B2B. We've got governance controls. We've got the ability to provide authentication and single sign-on functionality, which improves the user experience. And we've got a wealth of ways in which you can onboard these users. That's a lot more modern and a lot more seamless for a lot of organizations. So there's a lot of different advantages to leveraging this capability. And the last thing that I'll demonstrate before we stop here for question and answer is how does this affect Power Platform or applications therein, right? So Power BI and Power Apps, etc. I've got a sample Power App that you can see here. What I can do is I can actually share this Power App. And what I've done is I've actually shared the Power App with a group, an Azure Active Directory group or an Entra ID group that I've created. And I can use, if I wanted to, I could use an access package to put guest users in that group. I can also individually add, so we'll look for Jamie again, right? There he is, right? Coming from his external organization, I can share this with him, and I can choose whether or not I want to send him an email or not, and I can define whatever his permissions happen to be, right? And so that's how I would leverage that. The same tools, the same capabilities, they exist in other Power Platform features like Power BI, for example. Again, this is ad hoc sharing where I'm clicking and I'm choosing to share with a particular user. You can use other mechanisms to onboard users at scale, just like we demonstrated or showed or talked about earlier.